Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Suglia, Suglia, and I will be reading for you Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, which is my English translation of Jenseits von Gut und Böse, Vorspiel, einer Philosophie der Zukunft. And we left off with section 7, entitled Our Virtues. Permit me to make a few remarks on this section. This is video 12 in the video series, in which I read for you my English translation, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, and comment upon the text from time to time. So Nietzsche is implying in this section that morality is the invention of the intellectually weak, the intellectually inferior, right? Those who aren't very bright, those who aren't very intelligent. They use morality as a means of equalizing themselves with the intellectually superior, right? The intellectually sophisticated. It's a way of flattening things out. It's a brilliant argument, really. Why is this, though? Why? How is this? Well, morality provides the mediocre with a kind of making easy, a kind of easy leveling off, a kind of going linear, a plateauing, a making ordinary, a making average, a banalization, if you would. So in other words, if you apply the standards of morality to everyone, you bring the intelligent down to the stratum of the mediocre, right? Then the intellectually adept are lowered to the level of the most blockheaded blockhead on the block, right? So the brilliant are reduced to the level of average heads, right? And conversely, the most mediocre mediocrity is raised, is elevated by the grace of morality. And this is a corollary to the above argument. Belief in a God might be necessary to ground moral judgments. Perhaps some of the godly, not all of the godly, but some of the godly, some of the faithful, right, believe in a deity, in a celestial demiurge, in order to give anchoring to their moral judgments. And they need their moral judgments in order to improve their self-image, right? Their self-confidence is dependent on this. So I need to believe in an objective morality, in an objective foundation to a moral code. A moral code tells you, prescribes to you how to live your life. But I need to believe in an objective foundation, because if I don't, then I feel less than worthy, right? My own sense of self-worth is dependent on the objective foundation of morality, or in the presumption that there exists an objective foundation to morality, right? A transcendent origin, a transcendent source to all of morality. So even the most unremarkable person can be superior to everyone else from a moral point of view. So they can't compete in any other arena, but there's one arena in which they can compete, and that is the arena, the sphere of morality. And what is the basis of one's feeling of moral superiority? Belief in a God. Belief in a God. So it's kind of a dishonest belief, if you think about it. It's not really a sincere belief in God, or in any God, right? It's not sincere. Think about it. A moralist might say to a smarter person, okay, you're smart and successful in this world, but you are a sinner. You are immoral, and that makes me better than you, right? You are a reprobate. You are a transgressor. So perhaps I am a bit more than just your equal, right? I am your superior morally. There's a kind of arrogance there, right? There's a kind of vaunting of one's own superiority behind moral judgments. This explains the moralist's interest in morality perfectly, does it not? Does it not? You see, morality is a kind of insidious, devious, sanctimonious. According to Nietzsche, it is the idea that I am morally superior to you, even though you did better on the IQ examination than I did. Even though your intelligence quotient is higher than mine, I am a morally better human being than you are. And morality is the only standard that matters. It's the only game in town for the moralist, according to the moralist, right? This is implied by Nietzsche's argument. You are a bad person, and that makes me a good person. I feel as if I am a morally good person on the basis of your wickedness, your evilness, your infamy. This means that I need you to be sinister. Well, first of all, I need you, right? But secondly, I need you to be sinister in order to feel myself as good. So I need you to be evil, they say, right? They say, in order to vaunt my moral goodness. And I need my moral goodness because I don't want to compete with you in the cerebral arena, right? Or in any other arena. It could be, I don't know, it could be athletic. It could be literally that kind of an arena. I can't compete. I cannot compete with you intellectually or in any other way, but I can compete with you morally. This is the motive of the envious moralist. But of course, there is a great deal of disagreement on the foundation of morality, the putative foundation of morality, whether morality even has a firm foundation to begin with. Many people claim these days that morality is, they might not say this, but they seem to be implying that morality is a bit like food, right? In the same way that every culture has a different style of cuisine, every culture has a different standard of morality. But there's also something to think about. I mean, one has to consider time as well, right? Because cultures change, obviously. Everyone knows this. And so in each age, there is a different standard of morality. There's a different moral code. So morality varies according to time and according to space. Everyone knows this. But let's think about this. So what the moralist does is the moralist militates against temporal differences and spatial differences and cultural differences, things that every sociologist and every student of sociology knows to be the case, right? So what does the moralist do? The universalist moralist. What is the universalist moralist do? Well, what the universalist moralist does is anchor one's moral adjudications in the belief in a deity, right? In the belief in a God. This is a delicious argument that Nietzsche is making. Even if you disagree with it, it's a delicious argument. The leitmotif of this book, if it is a book, comes up in this section, section 7, again, our virtues. Truth is a lady, and no one should do her any violence, ever. One should be respectful of Dame Truth. The word for truth in German is feminine. Die Wahrheit, that's feminine. Die is feminine. with the associated pronoun sie, which you could actually render as she, right? So the pronoun for the German word for truth, die Wahrheit, is sie, which means, if you were to render that into English, she. Truth is a she. Truth is feminine in the German language, right? We've already come across the metaphor of Lady Truth in the preface of this text. We've already discussed that. If you'd like to know what I think about that, just watch and listen to Essay 1 in this video series. Anyway, in paragraph 231, and this is very interesting. This is after Nietzsche has discussed virtues, and he's paving the way to the next section of the text. In paragraph 231, Nietzsche points out the closures of his own thinking. It's fascinating. And no one ever quotes this passage, but I want to. And he is suggesting that his reflections on women or on woman are deeply flawed, are deeply problematical. How interesting is this? It's as if he's casting his own thoughts on womanhood, whatever that means, in relief. He's taking a distance from his own thinking. He posits that all dogmatism is a form of stupidity. That's something I've also talked about in video 1 of this series. All dogmatism, all dogmatic thinking is a form of stupidity, by definition. And I, Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche, I too am stupid. That's what he's saying. He's saying that I'm stupid. For I have axioms, uncritically accepted presuppositions, prejudices, preconceptions. I too, I Nietzsche, I have closures in my own reflection. There are certain things that I, Nietzsche, right? I'm just ventriloquizing here. There are certain things that I, Nietzsche, hold as axiomatic that shouldn't be held as axiomatic. This is my stupidity. There is a point at which I am unteachable. And Nietzsche is admitting that his thoughts on womanhood are stupid. He is acknowledging here his own unteachableness when it comes to womanhood, and his remarks on womanliness, whatever that means, should be read within that framework. This is why in paragraph 231, Nietzsche puts woman in itself in quotation marks. I don't want to do the rabbit ears. I hate that. I don't want to do that. This is also why Nietzsche derides the Goethe of Faust II, Faust II, the second volume of Faust, who celebrates the eternal feminine which pulls us in. I seem to be the only one who's translated that correctly. These are the famous final lines of Goethe's Faust. Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. Das ewig Weibliche zieht uns hinan. The eternal feminine pulls us in. Goethe is deriving this trope from Dante, right? From the Vita Nuova, but also the New Life, but also, of course, the Divine Comedy, Dante's masterwork, right? Incidentally, just parenthetically, incidentally. So Nietzsche ridicules this idea of the eternal. He asperses this idea of the eternal, celestial, divine feminine, which is really a masculine ideal in the same way that Nietzsche asperses, ridicules the dogmatists for misunderstanding Lady Truth. Nietzsche does not believe in an essentialized, hypostasized femininity. He doesn't believe in the reified feminine. Not at all. There is no such thing as the essence of the feminine, according to Nietzsche. And Nietzsche acknowledges this in paragraph 231, which I will read. In other words, Nietzsche parenthesizes the very reflections on womanhood that he puts forth. He suspends them. He brackets them out. This is why Nietzsche writes in paragraph 231 that his truths are merely his truths. It's what he says. He says, these truths are merely my truths, and that's it. They are merely his truths and nothing else. This is not arrogance. Far from it. Far from it. It is not as if Nietzsche were suggesting that his truths are the only truths that matter. That's not what that means. That's not what that means at all. No, he is suggesting that these are only his truths and they shouldn't be taken so seriously. And his so-called truths cancel themselves out. They actively negate themselves, which is why whatever Nietzsche writes about women should be taken as something in which he himself does not believe. What Nietzsche wants to do is to expose, to reveal, to disclose, to uncover and ridicule and disperse his own non-educability. His own non-educability. Nietzsche never claimed to be a god. No. However, anyone who claimed to be a god, Nietzsche pulled down into the muck, into the filth of our human, all too human world. Nietzsche is an apostate to the godhood which is himself. Okay, so what I'm going to be doing now is I'm going to be reading this section entitled Our Virtues. I will also be reading the all-important, all-decisive paragraph 231. I'm not going to be commenting much more. There are a few remarks I do want to make, only about 3 or 4. I don't really want to comment very much. Again, I'm just going to be reading for you the text, the translation that I have created of Nietzsche's great text. So let me pause and I will re-begin presently. The 7th section, Our Virtues, paragraph 214. Our virtues, we probably still have our virtues, but certainly not those squat, true-hearted virtues that our grandfathers held in esteem. Virtues that we keep at arm's length. We Europeans of the day after tomorrow. We firstborns of the 20th century. With all of our deleterious curiosity, with our multi-sidedness, with our art of disguise, with our friable yet sugary cruelty of spirit and sensuousness. If we must have virtues, we presumably would only have those that are compatible with our most intimate and most heartful proclivities, with our most flagrant requirements. Avaunt! Let us go searching for them in our labyrinths, wherein so many things are lost, wherein so many get lost. And is there anything lovelier than an expedition for one's virtues? Doesn't this almost mean believing in one's virtues? This believing in one's virtues, is this not fundamentally the same thing as what is called, in quotations, the good conscience? That honorable, longicaudal concept, that pigtailed concept. Longicaudal means having a long tail, having a tail. The one that our grandfathers used to wear on the backs of their heads. Often enough, they would wear it on the backs of their intellects, too. However little we might imagine ourselves to be old-fashioned and grandfatherly, in one respect we are, the worthy grandchildren of our grandfathers, we late-born Europeans with our good consciences. We too wear the pigtails on the backs of our heads. Oh, if we only knew how soon, how quickly something different were coming. Paragraph 215. As in the stellar realm, wherein two suns determine the path of a planet. In certain cases, multichromatic suns illuminate a single planet, now with red light, now with green, then cascade all of their colors upon that planet at once. So are we modern human beings. We are determined by the complex mechanics of our own starry heavens. We are determined by a variety of morals. Our actions are illumined by alternating colors. They are seldom unambiguous, and there are enough cases in which we perform chromatic actions. Paragraph 216. Love one's enemies. I believe that's well known. There are today thousands of instances of this, big and small. Indeed, something loftier and more sublime happens now and again. We learn to despise as we love, especially when we love best. But all of this is unconscious, noiseless, without pageantry, with the shame and concealedness of kindness, which forbids both solemn words and the formulae of virtue. Morality as attitudinizing. We find it tasteless these days. The fact that we find it tasteless is a kind of progress. Our fathers' progress was regarding religion as a form of attitudinizing, as something tasteless. This includes the enmity toward religion and the Voltairean bitterness toward religion, as well as everything else that belonged to the dactylology of free spirits back then. Nietzsche is alluding to Voltaire and Diderot. It is the music in our conscience, the dance in our spirit, which is never assonant with the litanies of the Puritans, the sermons of the moralists, or anything related to the bourgeoisie. 217. Watch out for those who invest in appearing morally tactful and sophisticated in moral decisions. They never forgive us when they slip up in front of us. They are especially unforgiving when they make a mistake concerning us. They will inevitably and instinctively slander us and insult us, even while remaining our friends, in quotes. Blessed are the forgetful, for then they too will have done with their stupidities. That was 217. I don't remember if I said that. 218. The French psychologists. Where today are there psychologists other than in France? The French psychologists have never ceased savoring with bitterness and in so many ways the bêtise bourgeoisie. No, they have never ceased savoring with bitterness and in so many ways the bêtise bourgeois. It is almost as if they were betraying something about themselves, right, in the sense of revealing. Flaubert, for instance, the good citizen of Rouen, ultimately saw, heard, or tasted nothing else. This was his style of self-torment and refined cruelty. Now for a change of pace, otherwise things would grow boring. I recommend another thing of delight, that is the unconscious deviousness that all good, corpulent, upstanding, mediocre spirits have toward higher spirits and their tasks. I mean that refined and meshed, Jesuitical deviousness, which is 1,000 times more refined than the intellect and taste of these mediocrities in any of their other best moments. Their deviousness is more refined than even the intellects of their victims. The higher spirits further evidence that instinct is the most intelligent form of intelligence that has hitherto been discovered. To be succinct, study, you psychologists, the philosophy of the rule in its conflict with the exception. There you will have a spectacle fit for the gods and for divine malice. Or to be relevant to contemporaneity, perform vivisection on good people, in quotation marks, on homo, bone, voluntatis. 219. Moral judgments and moral condemnations are the favorite form of revenge of the intellectually limited on those who are less limited intellectually. They are also a form of compensation for those who are poorly gifted by nature. Finally, they are an opportunity for the poorly gifted to acquire spirit and to become refined. The spiritualization of malice for the intellectually limited, it does their hearts good to know that there is a measure by which they may stand equal to those who are inundated with intellectual gifts. It does their hearts good to know that there is a measure by which they may stand equal to those who are privileged with intellect. They fight for the equality of all before God and almost need the faith of the God, the faith in God, for this purpose. The most vigorous adversaries of atheism are among their number. If someone were to say to them, the decency and respectability of someone who is merely moral cannot be compared with a high level of intellectuality, they would be infuriated. I will be careful not to say that to any of them. Good advice. Rather, I will flatter them with my proposition that a high level of intellectuality is nothing more than the final outgrowth of the moral qualities of which it consists. Instead, I will tell them that a high level of intellectuality is merely the synthesis of all of those conditions that had been individually acquired by the so-called merely moral. Conditions that had been acquired through a long process of breeding and practice, perhaps even through a series of generations. I would tell them rather that lofty intellectuality is just the spiritualization of justice and a sort of kindly severity which knows that it is entitled to maintain the order of rank in the world among things themselves and not just among human beings. There's a strategy right there. Okay. One moment. Paragraph 220, now Nietzsche is going to be writing about disinterestedness, which was all the rage in the wake of the publication of Kant's critique of judgment, Die Kritik der Urteilskraft. There's no such thing as a disinterested judgment. No. All judgment is interested. And there certainly is no such thing as a disinterested judgment in a work of art. I mean, if you're judging a work of art, you have to have something like a sensuous relationship to that work of art. Otherwise, you won't understand anything. A purely disinterested judgment does not exist. Anyway, I just want to give Nietzsche the floor, really. I'm the translator. I just want to stop. I just want to step back for a moment. Given the popularity of the term disinterested, one must become conscious of what truly interests people, perhaps not without danger. One must become conscious of the things that fundamentally and profoundly interest the common man, including the educated, even the scholars, and unless everything is other than what it seems, perhaps even the philosophers. The fact emerges that the majority of what interests higher natures, those with more sophisticated and fastidious tastes, will seem entirely uninteresting to the average person. Yes, that's true. If the average person notices a preoccupation with it nonetheless, he will name it désintéressé, and ask himself or herself, oneself, how it is possible to act disinterestedly, in quotation marks. There have been philosophers who knew how to give the popularity of disinterestedness, right? A seductive and mystical, otherworldly expression, perhaps because they never experienced a high nature. Instead of setting forth the naked and honestly simple truth that a disinterested action is a very interested and interesting action, provided that ... ellipsis. And love? How is that? Even an act performed out of love should be unegoic? No. Oh, you idiots. And the praise for self-sacrifice? This is what I wrote my dissertation on. Parenthetically, this is just me now. This is I. Every sacrifice, every self-sacrifice involves the reciprocity of interest. Every self-sacrifice involves the exchange of interest. There's no such thing as a pure self-sacrifice. That's one of the things that I write about in my dissertation. I'm sorry. But who would actually sacrifice oneself unless one knew that one wanted something for doing so and would receive something in return? That one surrendered oneself in order to have something more, perhaps to be something more, or indeed to feel oneself as being something more. But this is a realm of questions and answers in which a distinguished spirit, forename, right, would not dwell for a long time. This is precisely the moment at which truth would have to suppress a yawn. If she had to give an answer, in the end, truth is a woman. No one should do her any violence. 221. It comes about, said a moralistic pedant and nitpicker, that I prize and honor an unselfish person, not because he is unselfish. However, I prize and honor him because it seems to me that a moral person is someone who has the right to use another person at his own expense. Enough. It is always a question of who he is, or she is, and who that other person is. For example, for a person who was made and determined for command, self-denial, and self-withholding would not be considered virtues, but the squandering of virtues, rather. That is how it seems to me. Every unegoic morality that considers itself unconditional and directed toward everyone, does not just transgress against good taste, it also incites one to sins of omission, and is yet another seduction and a mask, under a mask, of philanthropy, a kind of seduction and offense to those who are higher, those who are rarer, those who are privileged. From the beginning, morality must be forced to bow before rank, order, hierarchy. The presumptuousness of moral gradation must be thrust into one's conscience until there's finally concurrence between them, until one finally recognizes that it is immoral to say what is right for one person is also fair for another. So says my moralistic pedant and bonhomme. Does he really deserve to be laughed at for pushing moral gradation into morality? But you shouldn't be too correct if you want the one who laughs at you to be on your side. A little kernel of wrong belongs even to good taste. And I would add, to good etiquette, to good manners. 222. Wherever pity is sermonized these days, and if you are listening carefully, you won't hear any religion other than the religion of pity being preached these days. Those psychologists who have ears, let them hear. Behind all of the vanity, behind all of the noise that is peculiar to these preachers, and vanity and noise are peculiar to all preachers. The psychologist will hear the real raspy, groaning sound of self-contempt. Self-contempt belongs to the benightedness and uglification of Europe, which have been growing for a century now. The first symptoms thereof can be found described in a thoughtful letter by Fernando Galliani to Madame d'Épinay. Self-contempt is a symptom of the benightedness and uglification of Europe, if it is not their cause. The person of modern ideas, that proud ape, is boundlessly discontent with himself, oneself. This has been established. One suffers, and one's vanity wants one to only suffer with others. Mitleid in German. Mitleid literally means with suffering. Pity is Mitleid. Pity means literally with suffering, suffering with, co-suffering. Pity is co-suffering. Mitleid. To suffer the suffering of pity. Let me move on. 224. The historical sense, or the ability to quickly guess the hierarchy of values by which a population, a society, a human being has lived. The divinatory instinct, for the characterization of values, for the relation between the authority of values and the authority of effectual forces. This historical sense, which we Europeans claim as our peculiarity, is a consequence of the bewitching, insane, semi-barbarism into which Europe has been plunged. And inasmuch as the most considerable part of human culture thus far has been semi-barbaric, Nietzsche just means uncultured. And he calls modern culture, modern German culture, uncultured, uneducated. This historical sense, in quotation marks, almost signifies an instinct for everything, the taste and tongue for everything, by which it immediately shows itself to be an undistinguished sense, right? It is unvornehm, right? We can enjoy Homer a second time, for example. Perhaps the appreciation of Homer is our most fortunate advantage, one that people of a more distinguished culture do not and did not know how to make their own, one that they hardly allowed themselves, such as the French of the 17th century, such as Saint-Alremond, who rejected Homer's esprit vaste, even the final notes of Voltaire. Now, Nietzsche here might be alluding to the later writings of Voltaire, but he also probably is alluding to Voltaire's Candide, which everyone knows. You might remember in Voltaire's novel Candide, Candide comes upon a library, and he notices that there's a book, and on the spine of the book is the name Homer. That's all he sees on the spine of this thick volume. And it's funny because this book contains the Iliad and the Odyssey in one tome, right? As if the Iliad and the Odyssey may be compacted into a single book without violence, without philological violence, right? Voltaire is making fun of this kind of compendium, encyclopedic historical sense in which texts are sandwiched together in the same way that Nietzsche inveighed in a less satirical manner, in a non-satirical manner, against the consolidation of the Hebraic Bible and the Christian Bible into one book called the Bible. The Hebraic Bible is a series of books, and then you have the Christian Bible, which was written in another language at another time. These are vastly different books, right? And they are compacted, they are consolidated, coalesced, congealed into one book, which is an act of philological violence. I mean, consider the fact that the Hebraic Bible is written in Hebrew, and the so-called New Testament, the Christian Bible, is written in Greek. And some biblical scholars, I'm not a biblical scholar, but some biblical scholars that I have read claim that the original language of the Christian Bible was probably Aramaic, at least for some of the books, for some of the Gospels, because Jesus and the apostles would have spoken Aramaic, and then perhaps it was translated to Greek. And then there's the Septuagint. The Septuagint is, Nietzsche has very, very severe things to write about the Septuagint. The Septuagint is like this massive Greek translation of the entire so-called Bible. And the Septuagint is really an act of philological violence because, as Nietzsche points out quite rightly, you're going to find in the Greek translation of the so-called Hebraic Bible, which is the Septuagint, right, twigs and little pieces of wood that are interpolated violently into the Hebraic Bible. I mean, it's funny, but it's really no joke. And why is this? Because those twigs, the branches, the roods, rood means, a crucifix, are meant to presage the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. And it's a way of saying that the so-called Old Testament, which I don't believe in, it's the Hebraic Bible, is somehow a predictor of the so-called New Testament. So anyway, that was a long divagation, sorry. The definitive yes and no of their palate, their readiness to feel disgusted, their tentativeness and reserve in relation to anything foreign, right? Nietzsche's not being xenophobic. He's criticizing the historicists of the 19th century. That's what he means by they. Their timidity before the tastelessness of even a lively curiosity, and the general unwillingness of every distinguished and self-subsistent culture to admit a new pleasantry, to admit any self-dissatisfaction, to admit an admiration for the exotic. All of this puts a distinguished culture in an unfavorable position toward, disposes a distinguished culture unfavorably toward the best things in the world. Whatever things cannot become their property or their prey, no sense is more incomprehensible to such distinguished people than the historical sense and its groveling, plebeian curiosity. I hope it's clear what Nietzsche is writing about. So as I'm sure you know, the 19th century was really the age of historicism. And Nietzsche is really criticizing very severely 19th century historicism. It is no different with Shakespeare, this amazing Spanish, Moorish, Saxon taste synthesis, which would nearly kill an ancient Athenian friend of Aeschylus with laughter or with rage. But we accept this wild play of colors, like all of Shakespeare's 45 plays, this gallimaufry of tenderness, vulgarity, and artistry, with a secret familiarity and warmth. So Shakespeare is dovetailed nicely and cleanly into the new historicism of the 19th century, even though, of course, Shakespeare wrote in the late 16th century and the early 17th century. We in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, we enjoy Shakespeare, we enjoy him, as an aesthetic refinement reserved solely for us, and do not allow ourselves to be disturbed by the repulsive fumes and the proximity of the English mob in which Shakespeare's art and taste lived. That certainly is true. The English mob comes up again and again, even in Shakespeare's Roman plays, like the most lamentable Roman tragedy of Titus Andronicus is really not about ancient Rome any more than the tragedy of Coriolanus is about ancient Rome. Both of these plays are about Elizabethan England, Shakespeare's England, I would argue. And Nietzsche knows this. Nietzsche is dead on when he writes about Shakespeare every time, well, almost every time. Nietzsche isn't right about Macbeth, but... So we don't allow ourselves to be disturbed by the repulsive fumes and the proximity of the English mob in which Shakespeare's art and taste lived, any more than we allow ourselves to be disturbed by the Chiaia in Naples, right? For those of you who don't know, the Chiaia today, in the early 21st century at least, is a very upscale district in Naples. It's very upmarket, very upscale. It's overflowing with boutiques. It's very ritzy, very affluent. You have to have money to shop there in the Chiaia. But apparently, according to Nietzsche, and I only know this through Nietzsche, apparently in the late 19th century, the Chiaia was a slum. I didn't know that. I mean, and I've had a hard time locating this information, but I can tell you that today, the Chiaia is not a slum, not anymore. It's a very fashionable, very chic district in Naples, to be sure. There, with all of our senses enchanted and willing, we go our way. However much the cloaca of the bad neighborhood stench the air. Cloaca, the toilets. The sewers, really. I mean, sewers. We people of the historical sense, we do have our virtues. That is indisputable. We are undemanding, selfless, modest, bold, completely self-overcoming, acquiescent, quite grateful, quite patient, quite accommodating. For all of that, we are not very tasteful, in quotation marks. Let us finally admit to ourselves that there is something which we people of the historical sense, in quotes, find difficult to comprehend, to feel, to taste once more, to love more. Let us finally admit that there is something which we are fundamentally prejudiced against and almost inimical to. It is the perfect and the ultimate. Now, I'm sorry, parenthetically, I actually talk about this, I lecture on this. If you're interested, watch and listen to my video on the Twilight of the Idols, Götzendämmerung, oder wie man mit den Hammer philosophiert. Twilight of the Idols, a late book by Nietzsche, a late polemic by Nietzsche, which it's called Twilight of the Idols in English, or How to Philosophize with a Hammer. Anyway, I have a whole video on that book. It's 90 minutes long, 90 minutes long, and the title of the video is What Does Not Kill Me Makes Me Stronger. What does this mean? By the way, I think it's, if you're interested in my videos, I've recommended that video to people as a good introduction to my style of commentary. And I honestly, I hope this doesn't sound vain, but I do recommend that video. It's one of my best videos. Anyway, I talk about that in this video. I'm so sorry. So it is the perfect and the ultimate, right? It is the ripeness contained in each culture and genre of art, the genuinely dignified element. Now in the German, that is das Vornehme, right? The genuinely dignified element, das Vornehme, in works and in people. It is the glimpse of smooth seas and halcyon self-sufficiency. It is the goldenness and the coolness in which all perfect things are displayed. Perhaps our great virtue, the historical sense, necessarily contradicts good taste. At least it contradicts the best taste. We are only able to reproduce the smallest, briefest, and highest turns of fortune and transformations of human life that light up here and there, and we are only able to do so poorly, haltingly, and with force. We enjoy every moment and miracle when a great force voluntarily stands before the measureless and illimitable. We enjoy the moments at which an excess of refined pleasure is suddenly trammeled and petrified, establishing and stabilizing itself upon a ground that is still shivering. Measure is alien to us, we must admit. Our impetus is the impetus of infinitude, of illimitedness. As if we were the rider on the horse, which snorts as it moves forward. We drop the reins, we moderns, we semi-barbarians, and we are those who are there first, there in our serenity, where we are also the most in danger. Now, I just want to say this parenthetically so there's no misunderstanding. Notice what Nietzsche is doing. The barbarian for Nietzsche is not the other. No, Nietzsche is saying he is a semi-barbarian. He is a semi-barbarian. We moderns are semi-barbarians. We who appreciate Shakespeare, for example, and who tolerate the bawdry in Shakespeare. We tolerate the mobbishness and the bawdry in Shakespeare. 225. Whether it is hedonism, whether it is pessimism, whether it is utilitarianism, whether it is eudaimonism, all of these ways of thinking are foreground ways of thinking and naivetes. They measure the worth of things by pleasure and pain. That is, according to subsidiary conditions and secondary matters. And this is just, if I may just insert myself into this, I would actually add to this optimism and pessimism. If you think about it, optimism is superficial and misrepresentative, and pessimism is superficial and misrepresentative. The question is nihilism superficial and misrepresentative? We have to talk about that. I think, you know what, I'm gonna The next time I pause, I'm going to write a note to myself. I should create a video on nihilism. Would you be interested in that? Let me know in the comment section below if you're interested in a video on nihilism. It just occurred to me right now, a video on nihilism. Why not, right? Anyway, sorry. No one who is conscious of the formative powers and the aesthetic conscience will look down upon them without mockery and pity. We pity you. Our pity is, of course, not pity as you mean it. It is not pity for social distress, in quotes, for society, in quotes, with its sick and its misfortunate. It is not pity for the ever burdened and the ever broken who lie around us on the ground. Even less is it pity for the strata of the grumbling, oppressed, rebellious slaves who strive for mastery, for regnancy. They call it, in quotes, freedom. They call it freedom, in quotes. Our pity is a loftier, more hyperopic pity. We see how humanity has been minimized. We see how you have minimized humanity. And there are moments when we look at your pity with an indescribable anxiousness. There are moments when we turn against this pity. There are moments when we find your seriousness more dangerous than any kind of frivolity. Whenever possible, you want to abolish suffering. And there has never been a crazier whenever possible. Never. And we wish that everything be intensified and worse than it was. Welfare as you understand it, that is no goal. It seems like an end to us. A state that makes human beings ridiculous and contemptible. He doesn't mean like social welfare. That's not what he means. That makes them desire their decline. The breeding of suffering, the great suffering. Do you not know that it has been just this breeding which has brought about the ascension of humanity? The tenseness of the soul when it is in a state of misfortune. This is what trains its strength. The shudder of the soul when it glimpses its own great destruction. Its sensitivity, its bravery as it bears, perseveres, deciphers, exploits its misery. And whatever gifts it has been given, profundity, mystery, masking, spirit, cunning, haven't they been given to the soul? Haven't they been given to the soul by suffering? By the discipline of the great suffering? Within every human being, creator and creature are unified. Within every human being is contained material, fragments, excess, mud, filth, nonsense, chaos. But within every human being also the creator, the educationalist, a kind of hammer hardness, a sort of divine spectatorship, and the seventh day are also present. Do you understand this contradiction? And that your pity concerns the creature in humanity. What must be shaped, broken, forged, rent, burnt, polished, purified. That is what necessarily suffers and must suffer, and our pity. Do you not understand at whom our inverse pity is directed? Do you not understand at whom our inverse pity is directed? Our inverse pity is directed against the feeblest and most cosseted. Thus, pity against pity, However, to say it once more, there are greater problems than all of the pleasure problems, suffering problems, and pity problems. And every philosophy that proceeds from such problems is a form of naivete. I'm rather enjoying this. Paragraph 226. We immoralists, the world that concerns us, the world in which we are frightened, the world in which we love, this nearly invisible, inaudible world of subtle commands, of subtle obedience, a world in which it almost exists in every respect, this spiny, tricky, spiky, cushy world. Indeed, this is a world that is shielded against vulgar spectators and overly familiar curiosity. We are spider-webbed in a strong net and garb of duties and cannot get out. Within, we are exactly the people of duty, even we. Now and then it is true we dance well in our chains, in quotes, and between our swords, in quotes. More often, it is just as true that we grind our teeth under the pressure and are impatient of the secret difficulties of our fate. But we are able to do what we want. Morons and appearances say against us, those people have no duties. We will always have morons and appearances against our side. 227. We cannot rid ourselves of our honesty. It's as if Nietzsche is saying here that we are mythophobes, right? A mythophobe is someone who's afraid of lying. Kafka found himself incapable of telling a lie, even though Kafka was a writer of fiction. We cannot rid ourselves of our honesty, we free spirits, assuming that it is our virtue to begin with. Now we want to work on our honesty with all the malice and love that we can muster, and will never grow tired of it. The only thing that remains for us now is the perfecting of the virtue of honesty. Like a gilded, azure, mocking twilight, may its glow settle upon this aging culture and all of its soggy, somber seriousness. And if our honesty nonetheless grows tired and sighs and stretches its limbs and finds us too hard and would rather that things be better and lighter and more tender like a pleasant vice, let us stay hard, we last Stoics. Well, here's another contradiction in the text. This text is chock-a-block with contradictions, with self-contradictions. I'm sure you'll remember earlier that Nietzsche criticized the Stoics in this very book. Oh, all right, there's a contradiction, a self-contradiction. And we will facilitate our honesty with all of the devilry that lies within us, our disgust for the crass and the approximate, our nitimur invetitum, our adventurer's courage, our shrewd and fastidious curiosity, our most refined and disguised intellectual will to power, and a world overcoming that lustfully rambles and raves over all of the realms of the future. Let us bring all of our devils, in quotes, to help out our God, in quotes. It is likely that people will be mistaken about us and misinterpret us because of this. Who cares? They will say, your honesty is nothing more than your devilry. Who cares? And even if they were right, isn't it the case that all gods heretofore are sanctified, rechristened devils? And ultimately, what do we know about ourselves? And what will be the name of the spirit that leads us? It is a matter of naming. And how many spirits will we conceal? Let us make sure that our honesty will never become our vanity, our finery, our gaudery, our finity, our stupidity. Oh, free spirits. Every virtue inclines to stupidity, as every form of stupidity inclines to virtue. Stupid to the point of holiness, as one says in Russia. Let us be careful not to become holy and boring out of honesty. Isn't life 100 times too short to be bored? One has to believe in eternal life in order to ... ellipsis. Let me conclude this statement by Nietzsche. Eternal life would be boring. 228. Forgive me the insight that all moral philosophy so far has been boring and soporific, and nothing has still done more to lower virtue in my eyes than the tediousness of its advocates. Still, I wouldn't want to misrepresent their general usefulness. It is important to note that the fewest number of people reflect on morality. It is even more important that morality should one day become interesting. However, do not be concerned. Things are today as they have always been. I have not seen a single European who conceived of moral reflection as something dangerous, risky, seductive, or catastrophic, or who communicated that moral reflection could be any of these things. See, for example, the indefatigable, inescapable English utilitarians. How crassly, how reverentially they follow the footsteps of Bentham, wandering here and wandering there. A Homeric parable says it clearer, as Bentham himself followed the footsteps of the revered Helvetius. No, he was not a dangerous man, this Helvetius, c'est senator poco courant, to quote Galliani. This is no new thought, nor is it the sophisticated modulation of an old thought, or even a crease in an old thought. It is not even the real history of what had been thought, an impossible literature on the whole, unless you know how to sillage it with a little malice. Sillaging fascinates me. I've used this metaphor in my essay on the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Check it out if you want to read my essay on Hamlet, the tragedy of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Sillage is when one preserves vegetables in a kind of marinade. I'm fascinated by this process. Anyway, you can read about it. That old English vice known as cant. No, I'm sorry, that's not Kant, but cant. Cant. Like jargon, right? C-A-N-T. With no apostrophe. That old English vice known as cant has insinuated into the works of these moralists, which one can read with second thoughts, on the proviso that one must read them at all. Kant is moralistic tartuffery that is disguised under the new form of scientificity, right? It's a form of charlatanry, right? It's a form of confidence tricksterdom, confidence tricksterism, confidence trickery, right? Trickery. There is chicanery. There is no shortage of secret defenses against the biting of the conscience that afflicts a race of former Puritans whenever they deal with a scientific conception of morality. Is a moralist not the opposite of a Puritan? Isn't a moralist a thinker, someone who considers morality as something questionable, as something worthy of a question mark, as something problematical? Shouldn't moralization be immoral? Ultimately, they all want English morality to be given its rights, since it would best serve humanity or the general utility or the fortune of the majority. No, rather, morality would best serve the fortune of England. They want to demonstrate with all of their power that striving for the fortune of England is the right path of virtue. By the fortune of England, I mean comfort and fashion, and in the best circumstance, a seat in Parliament. They believe that all the virtue that has ever existed in the world has consisted in such a striving. They're taking their immediate circumstances and they're sublimating them. They're moralizing their circumstances. Not a single one of these awkward, guilty conscience herd animals wants to know or to scent the fact that general welfare, in quotes, is far from being an ideal, far from being a goal, and far from being any kind of comprehensible concept. No, it's localized, right? They don't want to accept the fact that general welfare is nothing more than a vomitive. I almost translated that as an emetic, E-M-E-T-I-C. But I didn't. Vomitive, I like that better. Or what is fair for one person can absolutely not be fair for another person. Or the demand for a universal morality is the depreciation of the higher human being. That's one of Nietzsche's main arguments here. Or there is a hierarchy between one human being and another human being. Consequently, there is a hierarchy between one morality and another morality. The utilitarian Englishman is a modest and fundamentally mediocre kind of person. And as I said earlier, insofar as he is boring, one cannot think more highly of his utility. They should even be encouraged, as the following verses attempt to do to a certain extent. And I enjoyed translating this poem. This is a poem. Hail, you good wheelbarrow pushers, forever the longer the better, forever stiff in head and knee, spiritless, humorless, indestructibly mediocre, sans génie et sans esprit. Now we're going to, well, I'm going to read paragraph 229. So now we turn to a much misinterpreted passage, paragraph 229. Nietzsche is not recommending that his readers cultivate their sense of cruelty, not at all. He is remarking on the fact that human beings have a congenital tendency toward cruelty, that the taste for cruelty is something that is inborn within the human animal. Anyway, paragraph 229. The most recent epochs, which have every reason to be proud of their humanity, still have so much fear, so much superstitious fear of the savage, cruel beast. The mastery of the beast is precisely the reason for this human epoch's pride. Even palpable truths have remained unspoken for centuries, as if by mutual agreement, because it appears that these truths would help bring that savage beast back to life, that beast which took so long to kill off. I will be taking a risk to an extent if I let such a truth elude me. May others re-encage that truth and give it to drink, the milk of pious thinking, until the truth lies quiet and oblivious in its usual corner. It is important to unlearn and to relearn cruelty and to open one's eyes. Impatience should be finally learned so that such immodest, corpulent errors stop wandering around virtuously and impetuously. For example, the ideas about tragedy that have been fed to ancient and modern philosophers, almost everything that we call higher culture rests on the spiritualization and deepening of cruelty. This is my thesis. That savage beast has hardly been slaughtered. It lives, it blooms, it has just been deified. Cruelty is what constitutes the painful voluptuousness of tragedy. The agreeable effects of tragic pity, so called, derive their sweetness from the mixed-in ingredient of cruelty. Even the agreeable effects of sublimity, all the way up to the loftiest and tenderest shiverings of metaphysics, fundamentally derive their sweetness from the mixed-in ingredient of cruelty. The Roman in the arena, Christ in his ecstatic spasms on the cross, the Spanish in view of the heretic's pyre or the bullfight, the modern Japanese storming to see tragedies, the Parisian suburban laborer with his nostalgia for a bloody revolution, the Wagnerienne with her unhooked will, who loses herself over Tristan and Isolde. What all of these savor, what all of these strive to drink in with a secret fervor, is the spicy drink of the great Kirke, cruelty. We must indeed chase away the stupid psychology of yesterday, which only teaches of cruelty that it originates from the sight of a strange suffering. There is much more fertile, indeed an overly fertile enjoyment that comes from one's own suffering, from one's own making oneself suffer, as the Phoenicians and the ascetics did, or generally considered desensibilization, the flaying of the skin, contrition, the puritanical spasms, paroxysms of penitence, the vivisection of the conscience, the Pascalian sacrificio dell'intelletto, sacrifice of the intellect. Whenever this happens, he is secretly tempted by his own cruelty and charges forward with that dangerous shudder of self-directed cruelty. Ultimately, it should be considered that even the knower, by forcing his mind to know against his mind's tendencies, and often enough against the desires of his heart as well, says no where might have affirmed, loved, worshipped. The knower rules as artist and transmuter of cruelty. Even every taking as deep and taking as fundamental is a form of violation, a wanting to hurt the basic will of the spirit, which ceaselessly tends towards semblance and superficie. Even in every wanting to know, there is a droplet of cruelty. 230. Perhaps people will not immediately understand what I have said here about a basic will of the spirit. 230. Perhaps people will not immediately understand what I have said here about a basic will of the spirit. Permit me to elucidate. The commanding thing which people call the spirit wants to master itself and master everything around it and feel as if it were the master. It has the will to change plurality into unity. It is a binding together a trammeling, mastery-loving, and truly masterful will. Its requirements and capacities are the same as physiologists have established for all that lives, grows, and multiplies. The force of the spirit to appropriate the strange discloses itself in a strong tendency to assimilate the new with the old, to simplify the multiple, to oversee or to repel the contradictory. Just as it will arbitrarily highlight, extract, or falsify definite traits and lines of the strange, of some portion of the external world, in quotation marks, its intention is to incorporate new experiences, in quotes, to sequentialize new things into old sequences. Its intention, then, is growth, more precisely the feeling of growth, the feeling of augmented energy. The same will is served by an apparently oppositional drive of the spirit, a resolution to ignorance that suddenly breaks out. The arbitrary cutting off, the closing of its window, the interior no saying to this thing or to that thing, the not letting approach. The kind of defensive position against much that is knowable, the feeling of contentment with darkness, with shut-off horizons, the yes-saying, and calling ignorance good, all of which are necessary in accordance to the degree of its appropriative force, its digestive force, to use a metaphor. And truly the spirit does resemble a stomach more than anything. Likewise, here belongs the occasional will of the spirit to allow itself to be deceived, perhaps with a playful suspicion that things do not stand that way, that you just accept things as they are, perhaps with a feeling of pleasure in every uncertainty and equivocality, the joyous self-enjoyment and the arbitrary narrowness and intimacy of a corner, in the all too close, in the foreground, in the magnified, in the minimized, in the displaced, in the beautified, a self-enjoyment in the arbitrariness of all of these expressions of power. Finally, there belongs here that not quite harmless readiness of the spirit to deceive other spirits and to disguise itself from them, the constant pressure and intensity of a creative, formative, mutable force. The spirit enjoys the plurality of its masks and its shrewdness. It also enjoys the feelings of its security. It also enjoys the feeling of its security behind the mask. It is precisely through its protean arts that it is best protected and hidden. This will to semblance, to simplification, to the mask, to the cloak, in short, to the superficial. For every surface is a cloak, counteracts that sublime tendency of the knower that accepts things and desires to accept things as deep, multiple, and fundamental. The sublime tendency of the knower is a kind of cruelty of the intellectual conscience and taste, which every valiant thinker will acknowledge resides within him or her, assuming that, as befits one, one's eye has hardened and sharpened itself long enough and is used to strict discipline, even to stern words. One will say, there is something cruel in the tendency of my spirit. May virtuous, lovely people try to dissuade him or her from it. In fact, it would sound more graceful if one, instead of cruelty, accused us of extravagant honesty, or murmured it to us, or praised us for it. We free, very free spirits, we free, quite free spirits. And perhaps this is what our posthumous fame will be. In the meantime, for there will be time before then, we are the least likely to gussy ourselves up with such moralistic verbal baubles and verbal frippery. Our entire work thus far has been spoiled by this taste and its lively luxuriousness. These are such beautiful, glittering, clanging, festive words: honesty, the love of truth, the love of wisdom, sacrifice for the sake of knowledge, the heroism of the truthful. There is something within these words that swells one's pride. But we hermits and marmots, we have long since persuaded ourselves to assume the secrecy of the hermit's conscience, we have long since persuaded ourselves that this pompous verbal display belongs to the cladding of old lies, to the rubbish and gold dust of unconscious human vanity. And we have persuaded ourselves that beneath the smarmy coloring and overpainting, the terrible foundational text, Homo Natura, is still recognizable. To retranslate the human being into nature, to become master over the many vain and fanatical interpretations and adjoining senses of nature, which had been hitherto scribbled and painted over the eternal foundational text, Homo Natura, to ensure that the human being stands henceforth before human being as one does today, hardened in the discipline of science before the other nature, with unfrightened Oedipus eyes and stopped Odysseus ears, deaf against the seductive means of old metaphysical bird catchers, which had warbled at him for too long. You are more, you are higher, you are of another origin. This may be a strange and insane task, but it is a task. Who would deny it? Why would we choose it, this insane task? Or to put it another way, why know anything at all? Someone will ask us this question, and we, thus pressured, we who have been asked the same thing 100 times, we found and find no better answer. Ellipsis. Finally, 231, this is the end of section 7. Learning transforms us. It does what all nourishment does, that does more than merely keep one alive, as every physiologist knows. But at bottom, our deepest bottom, there is indeed something unteachable, the granite of an intellectual fatum that gives predetermined decisions and answers to select predetermined questions. From within, each cardinal problem speaks an immutable, so I am. This is how I am. This is just how I am. As to man and woman, for instance, a thinker cannot relearn. He can only cease learn. He can only cease learn. He can only uncover at last what he considers established, in quotes. In time, certain solutions are found to problems that inspire within us a firm belief. Perhaps one will name them henceforth one's convictions. Later, one sees them as nothing more than footsteps to self-knowledge, guideposts to the problems that we are, or rather, guideposts to the great stupidity which we are, to our intellectual fatum, to the unteachableness of our down below. On the account of the abundant graciousness that I bestowed upon myself, perhaps I will be permitted to pronounce a few truths concerning the woman in itself, in quotation marks, on the condition that one understands from the outset that these are merely my truths, which is to say that they shouldn't be taken seriously. I've already spoken about this. I've expanded on this. I've enlarged on this subject already at the beginning of this video. Thank you very much. We have now reached the end. We have now reached the end of the section entitled Our Virtues. And yeah, we have also reached the end of video 12. So thank you very much. This is Joseph Suglia once more Reading for you my English translation, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, and commenting on the text. Thank you very much. I hope that you'll continue to watch and to listen. I hope that you're benefiting from this recitation of my English translation, and I hope that you're profiting, non-monetarily, but I hope that you're profiting from my lectures and my commentaries as well. Thank you very much. This is Joseph Suglia, S-U-G-L-I-A, signing out and signing off. Thank you very much. Goodbye.